The Jedi didn't fall because they were arrogant. They didn't fall because they were too powerful. They fell because they chose to protect the wrong thing. Instead of protecting the will of the Force and the people of the galaxy, they chose to protect the Republic, and more specifically, the Senate. And once that line was crossed, everything else was inevitable. We've all heard the standard explanation. The Jedi became blind, dogmatic, and disconnected. And sure, that's true on the surface, but that's not the root of the problem. The real issue is that they tied themselves so tightly to political power that they stopped being impartial guardians and became an arm of the state. Once that happened, they weren't following the Force anymore. They were following policy. The Ruusan Reformations, the beginning of the drift. If you trace this back properly, the turning point isn't the Clone Wars, it's the Ruusan Reformations. After the new Sith Wars, the Republic restructures itself, demilitarizes, and the Jedi effectively become the primary peacekeeping force of the galaxy. On paper, that sounds noble. The Republic doesn't maintain a standing army, so the Jedi step in to protect peace. But think about what that actually means. It means that the Jedi are no longer following the Force to where imbalance actually exists. They are responding to Senate requests. They are deployed by political decision. They become accountable to a governing body. And over centuries, the connection tightens to the point where the Jedi Temple is literally built on Coruscant, at the heart of the Republic. From that moment on, the Jedi's identity slowly shifts. They're not just Force mystics anymore. They're Republic officials with lightsabers. And that shift is subtle, but it's catastrophic. Protectors of peace, but on whose side? Now here's the counter-argument. The Jedi are protectors of peace. Of course they need to intervene. Of course they need to help stop wars and reduce casualties. If they sit back and do nothing, that's negligence. And that's true, but only halfway. The Jedi absolutely should intervene in conflicts, but they should intervene without bias. They should protect civilians, defend balance, and resolve violence where they can. What they should not do is automatically take the side of the Republic, simply because it is the Republic. Once you enter a war already aligned with one side, you lose neutrality. And once you lose neutrality, the galaxy no longer sees you as guardians of peace, but as the Republic's enforcers. That's exactly what happens in the Clone Wars. Planets choose to leave the Republic and join the Separatists. Whatever you think about the leadership of the Confederacy, many of those worlds made that decision willingly. They weren't occupied, they weren't enslaved, they seceded. And what does the Republic do? It invades them and calls it liberation. The Jedi become generals in an army sent to reclaim those systems. That's not peacekeeping, that's conquest. Even if you believe the Republic's intentions were better. The Jedi didn't see it that way, because they couldn't. Their loyalty had already been decided. If you are enjoying the Star Wars deep dive, it's practically all we do here, so you might want to stick around. When Peacekeepers become generals, the moment the Jedi accepted command of the clone army, something fundamental broke. They weren't mediators anymore. They weren't independent agents of the Force. They were military commanders directing troops in a galactic war. Once they accepted that role, Palpatine didn't even have to corrupt them. He just had to wait. Palpatine didn't twist the Jedi into something they weren't. He exploited what they had already become. An order that takes military rank from a chancellor is already politically compromised. An order that fights to preserve a specific government is no longer neutral. That's why Order 66 worked so cleanly. The Jedi had positioned themselves as leaders of a state army. They had attached their survival to the Republic's survival. So when the Republic redefined them as enemies, they had no independent foundation to stand on. If the Jedi had remained neutral, if they had refused to command an army, Order 66 doesn't even exist in the same way. There are no clone battalions embedded under Jedi leadership across the galaxy. There's no coordinated betrayal. The trap only works because they stepped into it willingly. They stopped following the will of the Force. This is where the philosophical damage really shows. The Jedi were originally meant to follow the will of the Force, not the will of the Senate. That distinction matters. The Force isn't political. It doesn't recognize borders or trade disputes. It responds to imbalance, suffering, corruption, wherever it exists. But by the time of the prequels, the Jedi are hesitant to act without council approval, which itself is influenced by political consequences. They deliberate over how the Senate will react. They worry about optics. Look at Qui-Gon Jinn. He refuses a seat on the council because he believes it would limit his ability to follow the living force. That's not rebellion for the sake of ego. That's a Jedi recognizing institutional drift. He understands that proximity to power comes with compromise. And then there's Count Dooku. Before he becomes a Sith, he leaves the Order because he sees the corruption and stagnation. In Tales of the Jedi, we see him directly disobey instructions to side with a corrupt ruler, choosing instead to defend civilians. That is a Jedi acting on principles over politics. The tragedy is Dooku's instincts weren't entirely wrong. The Order had drifted. He just chose the worst possible solution. The Republic wasn't always the good guys. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Republic during the Clone Wars wasn't morally spotless. It's corrupt, bureaucratic, and deeply influenced by corporate interests. Entire star systems feel exploited. Trade disputes escalate into military conflicts because negotiation fails. When those systems choose to leave, the Republic doesn't say, "We'll respect your sovereignty." It says, "We'll reclaim you." And the Jedi stand beside that decision. That's where the moral high ground starts to erode. Because if you're a citizen of a separatist world, and Jedi-led clone forces arrive in orbit, you don't see guardians of peace. You see invaders. It doesn't matter how noble their intentions are. Perception becomes reality. The Jedi weren't protecting people in those moments. They were protecting the political unity of the Republic. And those are not the same thing. Anakin was the ultimate symptom. If the Jedi had protected their philosophy instead of their institution, Anakin Skywalker likely never falls. Think about it. He's a child born of the Force itself, the literal chosen one. And instead of adjusting their rigid structures to nurture him, the Order forces him into a system that fears attachment, fears emotion, fears deviation. Earlier Jedi traditions were less strict about relationships. Attachment wasn't treated as immediate corruption, but by the end of the Republic era, the Order is so dogmatic that they interpret any deviation as danger. And why? Because political pressure demands predictability. Because the Senate expects discipline. Anakin doesn't just fall because he's impulsive. He falls because the Jedi don't trust him. And they don't trust him because they've lost confidence in their own connection to the Force. They rely on rules instead of intuition. If they had truly believed in the will of the Force, they would have trusted that whatever path Anakin walked was part of balance. Instead, they tried to control it, and that control backfired catastrophically. The Force demanded change. By the time Order 66 happens, the Jedi aren't wiped out randomly. They're wiped out at the height of their political entanglement. They are generals, diplomats, advisors, everything except independent seekers of balance. And I genuinely think that matters on a mythic level. The Force in Star Wars isn't passive. It responds to imbalance. If the Jedi have become rigid, politicized, and disconnected from the living Force, then something has to break. The destruction of the Order isn't just Sith victory, it's correction. That's why their survival through figures like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda is so important. In exile, stripped of political power, they rediscover humility. They reconnect with something deeper. They're no longer Republic officials. They're just Jedi. And that version of the Jedi is closer to the original ideal than the Council Chamber ever was. They protected the Senate, not the Force. At the end of the day, the Jedi believed they were protecting peace. They confused the Republic's survival with the galaxy's well-being. The Senate became the priority. The institution became sacred. And when you protect an institution over your principles, you lose the very thing that made you worthy of protection in the first place. Palpatine didn't destroy the Jedi Order from the outside. He exploited a flaw that had existed for 1,000 years. The Jedi had already chosen politics over philosophy, war over neutrality, structure over trust in the Force. If they had remained impartial, if they had refused to become generals, If they protected their trust in the Force above all else, the Clone Wars likely would never have happened. Order 66 likely doesn't come about. Anakin's path completely changes. The Jedi protected the Republic. They should have protected the Force. And because they chose wrong, they lost everything. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe and let's uncover the galaxy's greatest secrets together. Thanks for watching.